Nobody looks twice at a delivery girl at 2 a.m. That's the whole reason I'm still alive.
Rain hits the alley like static. 1:47 a.m., Mapogu. Juliet Adeyemi is 30 seconds from clocking out when she sees the black sedan parked sideways across the mouth of the alley, engine running, no plates lit. Three men in wet dress shirts have a fourth man on his knees against the brick, a blade already drawn. She doesn't know his name. She doesn't know what he's worth. She knows the weight of a full delivery helmet swung at full extension, because she's dropped it on her own foot twice this month cutting corners on scooter turns. Tonight it becomes a weapon instead of an accident. Juliet's been invisible in this city for 2 years, the kind of invisible that comes from carrying other people's dinners up 6 flights of stairs for tips that don't cover the elevator she can't afford to wait for. Blue uniform, cracked phone screen, a route memorized down to which streetlights flicker. Nobody looks twice at a delivery driver at 2 a.m. That's exactly why the three men don't register her as a threat when she steps out from behind a dumpster. They clock the backpack, the helmet, the exhaustion in her posture, and dismiss her before she's even finished moving. That mistake costs the nearest one his grip on the knife. She doesn't know yet that the man she just dragged onto the back of her scooter runs half the money moving through this city after dark. She just knows a person was about to die in front of her, and some stubborn, inconvenient part of her wouldn't let that happen quietly. By the time she realizes exactly who she pulled out of that alley, and exactly who's now hunting them both, there's no clean way to put him back down. The luxury sedan was parked wrong, and that was the first thing Juliet noticed. Not double-parked, not sloppy, deliberately angled across the mouth of the alley, blocking it the way a hand blocks a door. She'd been running this route for 2 years, knew every inch of Mapogu the way other people knew their own kitchens, and a car sitting like that at 1:47 a.m. read as wrong the same way a locked door reads as wrong when you know it's always been open. She should have turned around. She had a food delivery 3 blocks over, congee going cold in her insulated bag, and a customer who'd already texted twice asking where she was. Instead she cut the scooter's engine and walked the last stretch, helmet still on, because some part of her, the part that had learned to read a room the hard way, wanted to see what kind of car sat like a threat before she rode past it. That was when she heard it. Not shouting. Something quieter and worse. The particular scrape of a shoe finding its footing before a fight, the low murmur of men who weren't arguing so much as finishing a conversation with their hands. She came around the corner slow, in the shadow the streetlight didn't reach, and saw 3 men in dark, expensive suits standing in a loose triangle around a fourth man pinned against the wet brick. 2 of them had knives out, held low and easy, the way people hold things they've used before. The man against the wall wore what had been an excellent suit an hour ago, now torn at the shoulder, a thin line of blood tracking from somewhere above his ear down the side of his jaw. He wasn't panicking. That was the strange part. He was watching all 3 of them at once, calculating, the way a man does when he still believes there's a way out even as the walls close in. Juliet had exactly 2 things in her hands. A delivery helmet and a fully loaded insulated backpack that weighed close to 9 kilograms with 3 orders still inside it. She had, in the 2 full seconds she allowed herself to think, absolutely no plan beyond the certainty that she was not going to get back on her scooter and ride away from a man about to be killed in an alley 6 blocks from her apartment. She stepped out of the shadow. The nearest assassin barely turned his head. That was his mistake, and later she'd understand it was the same mistake people made about her constantly, the blue uniform, the backpack, the exhausted posture of someone who'd been on shift 12 hours, all of it reading as background noise, as something that didn't require a second look. He was already dismissing her when the helmet caught his wrist mid-swing, full weight behind it, and the knife clattered against the brick and skittered into a drain grate. He made a sound that wasn't quite a shout, more surprise than pain, and by the time it registered that his hand didn't work right anymore, Juliet had already pivoted, swinging the backpack in a wide, ugly arc that connected with the second man's temple hard enough to fold his knees. 9 kilograms of thermal bag, 2 servings of congee, and a bottle of banana milk turned out to be an excellent weapon against a man who hadn't expected to be hit with dinner. The third man lunged, And this was the one who almost got her. She felt the blade pass close enough to catch the sleeve of her jacket, a thin cold line she wouldn't notice until later. But the man against the wall moved at the same moment, driving his shoulder into the assassin's ribs with the flat, economical violence of someone who had done this before, who had perhaps once been the most dangerous person in rooms exactly like this one. It bought her a second and a half. She didn't waste it. "Move," she said, grabbing his collar, and something about the flatness of her voice, no fear in it, no question, just an instruction, made him move before he'd fully decided to trust her. He was heavier than he looked, all suit and muscle and the dead weight of a body running on adrenaline and blood loss, but Juliet had spent 2 years hauling delivery crates up 6 flights of stairs with no elevator, and she got him onto the back of her scooter the way she'd gotten 100 stubborn boxes into 100 stubborn doorways, not gracefully, but completely. The engine caught on the second try. Behind them, one man was still on the ground, one was cradling a wrist that wouldn't close into a fist again for weeks, and the third was already moving, already shouting something into a phone, and Juliet didn't wait to hear what. She took the back route through Mapogu, the one that existed only if you'd spent 2 years learning which alleys connected to which stairwells, which gates the property management never locked, which one-way streets a scooter could cut against if you knew the timing of the traffic cameras. The man behind her held on without a word, one hand pressed flat against his ribs, and she could feel him assessing, even now, even bleeding. Cataloging exits, distances, the make of her scooter, the way she rode. He asked no questions. She offered no answers. It was, she thought later, the strangest kind of trust, two strangers agreeing, without discussion, that survival came before curiosity. The subway maintenance room was 3 blocks from her building, accessible through a service gate that had been broken for longer than she'd lived in the neighborhood, and known to almost nobody except the small, invisible fraternity of night couriers who used it as a place to sit down, warm up, and wait out bad weather between deliveries. She'd stocked it herself, slowly, over months. A first aid kit zipped into the bottom of her delivery box, a battery lantern, 2 folding chairs nobody official had ever approved. She rolled the gate down behind them and, for the first time since the alley, let herself breathe. He sat where she pointed without argument, which told her something about how much pain he was actually in. She got the lantern going, then knelt in front of him and opened the first aid kit, and it was only in that harsher, steadier light that she saw the full damage, the cut above his ear that would need more than a bandage, the forearm laid open in a thin diagonal line, the way he held his left side like it hurt to breathe too deeply. "This needs stitches," she said, nodding at his head. "You know how to do that. I've done worse to myself in a kitchen with worse lighting." She held her hands up, steady, and he watched them the way a man watches something he's trying to decide whether to trust. He didn't flinch when she cleaned the wound. He didn't make a sound through 4 stitches, and she noted that the way she noted everything, filed it away without comment. It was somewhere in the silence that followed, needle and thread packed away, gauze taped over his forearm, that he finally spoke again, in English carefully practiced across years of rooms that weren't his own. "You don't know who I am." "No." "Would it change what you just did?" She considered that honestly, because he seemed to actually want an answer. Would it have changed whether 3 men had knives out in an alley? No. So, no. He almost smiled at that, the first real movement his face had made all night that wasn't pain. His name, he told her, was Cho Young-yoon, and the men in that alley hadn't been random. He ran one of the largest logistics and finance networks operating in the gray spaces beneath Seoul's legitimate economy. Shipping routes, cash flow, information, the kind of infrastructure most people never saw and everyone quietly depended on, and 3 hours ago, his own second-in-command had decided that infrastructure would run better without him in it. The men in the alley hadn't been sent by a rival. They'd been sent by someone who, until tonight, had eaten dinner across the table from him twice a week for 6 years. Juliet sat with that for a moment, turning it over, and found that it didn't scare her nearly as much as it should have. Mostly it made her tired, in the specific way that came from realizing the night was nowhere near finished. It was 2 days later, in that same maintenance room, that she noticed her phone behaving strangely. The delivery app pinging with location requests it had no business making at 3 in the morning, refreshing her position every few seconds instead of the standard interval, routing pings through a server address she didn't recognize when she finally thought to check. She wasn't naive about her own phone. 2 years of gig work had taught her more about app permissions and background data than she'd ever wanted to know, mostly out of self-defense against a company that liked to quietly change its terms of service. It took her 20 minutes of digging through settings and packet logs on Yang Yun's borrowed laptop to confirm what her gut had already told her: the app wasn't just tracking her deliveries. Something, or someone, had grafted an additional layer onto it weeks ago, quietly logging her movements across the district with a level of detail no delivery company needed. "They didn't find us by luck," she said, turning the screen toward him. "They found us through my app." His jaw tightened. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't recent either. The access had clearly been installed before that night in the alley, which meant somebody had been watching her patterns long before she'd ever stepped between him and a knife. That thought settled uncomfortably. She didn't like the idea that she'd been a variable in someone else's plan before she'd chosen to be one in her own. She didn't panic. Panicking wasn't useful, and useful was the only currency she had left. Instead, she borrowed a second phone from a courier 2 floors up in her building, an old handset he kept for exactly this kind of situation, the unglamorous paranoia of people who worked nights in a city that didn't always wish them well, and spent an hour cloning her delivery app signal onto it, routing it through a decoy scooter parked and left running near a busy intersection in Mapo, 3 kilometers from where they actually were. It wasn't sophisticated work, not compared to whatever real hackers could do, but it didn't need to be sophisticated. It needed to be convincing for about 6 hours, long enough to buy them room to move. It worked better than she expected. By morning, the courier grapevine, the same informal, half-joking group chat night drivers used to complain about bad tippers and warn each other about aggressive dogs, was lit up with reports of black sedans circling an intersection near Mapo Station, going nowhere, clearly hunting something that wasn't there. That was when she understood, fully, what she actually had access to. Not just a decoy phone. A network. 30-some night couriers who moved through this city like blood through veins, who saw everything and were seen by no one, who had spent years being underestimated by exactly the kind of men who now wanted Yang Yun dead. She took him to Auntie Sue's, a 24-hour diner tucked behind a laundromat that had fed 3 generations of night shift workers reheated stew and unlimited coffee, and asked Auntie Sue, who had fed Juliet more free meals than either of them would ever admit to out loud, to spread the word. By the following night, she had eyes on a dozen major intersections across 3 districts. Drivers she barely knew by name were sending her real-time updates through the group chat, flagging unfamiliar sedans, noting which corners had new, unexplained foot traffic. Nobody asked too many questions. In this line of work, you learned not to, and you learned that watching out for each other was sometimes the only insurance policy available. It was in the gray hour before dawn, in the back booth of Auntie Sue's, that Yang Yun finally handed her the flash drive. He'd been carrying it, he admitted, since before the alley, sewn into the lining of his jacket, the one piece of evidence solid enough to end his former second-in-command permanently, if it ever reached the right eyes. Encrypted, naturally, and layered with enough security that it had taken him months to build the access himself. He hadn't trusted it to anyone. Not until 3 assassins and a woman with a delivery helmet had rearranged what trust meant to him. They borrowed a diagnostics laptop from Min Jun, a courier who moonlighted repairing motorbikes and, it turned out, had a surprising talent for cracking open old encrypted systems, a hobby, he said, that had started with unlocking second-hand phones and had gotten steadily more ambitious. It took the 3 of them most of the night, working in the diner's back booth with cold coffee and Auntie Sue occasionally sliding over another plate of rice she insisted nobody had asked for. But by the time gray light started creeping through the front windows, the drive was open. What it contained was worse than either of them had expected, and more useful. Ledgers. Years of them. payments routed through shell accounts to 2 mid-level officials and 1 very senior one, alongside internal communications that made the intent unmistakable, a hostile takeover of Yang Yun's entire network, engineered from the inside, timed to finalize at midnight during an event that would put every relevant player in one room under the appearance of legitimate business. The event was 3 days away. A private gala at the Grand Millennium Tower, hosted, on paper, as a celebration of a cross-industry logistics partnership. In practice, Juliet understood as she read further, it was the moment the trader intended to make his new arrangement permanent, in front of the exact officials whose names filled the ledger, in a room designed to look like nothing was happening at all. She looked up from the screen and met Yang Yun's eyes, and something in her chest settled into a kind of certainty she hadn't felt in a long time, not fear, not quite excitement either, but the specific, steadying clarity of finally knowing exactly where the fight was going to happen. Then that's where we need to be, she said. Outside, the city was waking up around them, buses grinding past, shutters rolling open, 1,000 people starting their ordinary Tuesday with no idea that 3 days from now, in a glass tower rising over all of it, something was going to come apart at the seams. The plan came together the way most of Juliet's best ideas did, not in a single flash of brilliance, but in the accumulation of small, boring facts nobody else in the room had bothered to notice. She'd been inside the Grand Millennium Tower a dozen times before, dropping off catering orders for private events, and she knew things about that building that no security consultant would ever think to ask a delivery driver. She knew the loading dock on the east side ran on a rotating schedule of 3 catering companies, and that the guards there checked badges against a printed list instead of a live system, because the tower's IT department had never gotten around to fixing the sync issue. She knew the service elevator stopped on a mezzanine level that wasn't on the public floor directory. She knew, because she'd waited in it herself more times than she could count, that the maintenance corridor behind the kitchens connected almost the entire building without ever crossing the lobby. "You're not getting through the front," she told Yang Yun, spreading a printout of the building's public floor plan across Auntie Sue's back table, marking it up with a pen borrowed from the register. "Whoever's running security for this event will have your face flagged. Mine, they've never seen. I've delivered food to this building 40 times and nobody's looked at me twice." He studied the map, then studied her, and something in his expression settled into the particular quiet of a man recalculating who was actually in charge of the room. "Then I follow you." "You follow me," she agreed. "You know finance and leverage. I know service entrances and staff shift changes. Tonight, mine matters more." He didn't argue, which told her more about how much had shifted between them since the alley than anything he could have said out loud. The network handled the rest. Word went out through the courier group chat in the same easy, coded shorthand they used for everything, a request dressed up as ordinary gossip, 30 drivers agreeing without needing to be told twice why it mattered. By the night of the gala, a dozen decoy deliveries had been scheduled to arrive at the tower's main entrance in a tight, overlapping window. Flowers, extra catering trays nobody had ordered, a wine delivery timed to create exactly the kind of minor logistical headache that pulled floor security's attention toward the front of the building and away from the loading dock around back. Juliet dressed for the part the way she'd learned to dress for anything that mattered, not flashy, just correct. A dark, tailored courier uniform from one of the high-end catering services, the kind reserved for events with real money behind them, a locked aluminum briefcase in one hand in place of her usual insulated bag. Inside it, wrapped in a spare jacket to keep it from rattling, sat the hard drive holding every ledger, every wiretap, every name Yang Yun's trader had spent years burying. Yang Yun went in 20 minutes ahead of her, dressed as a maintenance technician in coveralls borrowed from Minjun's garage, a laminated badge clipped to his chest that wouldn't survive close scrutiny but didn't need to. Floor technicians moved through service corridors all night, and nobody working an event this large stopped to question one more man with a tool bag. He slipped past the perimeter guards at the east stairwell exactly the way Juliet had said he would. Not by hiding, but by looking like he belonged, walking with the specific unbothered pace of someone who'd done this 100 times before. The trouble started on the lower service floors, which was, in its own way, exactly what Juliet had expected. Whoever the traitor had sent wasn't relying on the front entrance either. She caught the first sign of it on her way through the loading dock, two men in generic maintenance jackets who didn't quite move like maintenance men, who checked door badges too carefully and lingered too long near the freight elevators. She didn't confront them. She didn't need to. She sent one text to the group chat, for words that meant more to that network than a paragraph would have to anyone outside it, and kept walking. It became, from there, a quiet kind of hunt. Not the loud, cinematic kind, but the version that actually happened in buildings like this one, played out in narrow corridors full of pipe insulation and breaker panels, between men who all understood that a scene in a service hallway was a scene that got noticed. Yang Yin found himself flanked, at one point, by a hitman who'd clearly expected to find him alone and unarmed, and discovered instead that a courier named Dae-ho, built like the doorway he'd just come through, and none too pleased about giving up his night shift for this, had been shadowing Yang Yin's position for the last 10 minutes on Juliet's instruction. Between the two of them, and a fire extinguisher swung with more enthusiasm than technique, the hitman ended up folded into a supply closet with a door that latched from the outside. A second one wasn't so easily managed. He came around a corner fast, already reaching for something under his jacket, and it was three couriers together, Dae-ho, a wiry ex-boxer named Sunwoo who delivered for 3 different apps just to make rent, and Yang Yin himself, moving with the leftover instincts of a man who'd survived rooms far worse than this one, who got him pinned against a security gate long enough to wrench it shut behind him, trapping him in the narrow stretch between 2 fire doors with nowhere useful to go. It wasn't elegant. It didn't need to be. It bought time, and time was the only currency that mattered now. Juliet, meanwhile, was 3 floors up, off the official service route entirely, working her way through a ventilation shaft she'd scouted 2 nights earlier during a catering drop-off, when she'd noticed the access panel behind the 3rd-floor supply closet led into a shaft that ran, uninterrupted, most of the way to the broadcast control room above the main ballroom. It was tighter than she'd expected, and considerably dustier, and by the time she dropped down into the narrow service hallway outside the control room her uniform was ruined and her hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline she hadn't let herself feel until now. She didn't stop to catch her breath. She didn't have the time. The control room held one technician, headset on, half watching a bank of monitors that fed every screen in the ballroom below. The massive display wall behind the stage, the smaller feeds mounted along the walls for guests too far back to see the podium clearly. He didn't hear her until she was already inside, and by then it was too late for him to do anything but put his hands up when she made it very clear, with a calm that surprised even her, that this wasn't a negotiation. She had him zip-tied to his own chair with a cable pulled from the equipment rack in under 2 minutes, and then she was in front of the console, running her hands over controls she'd never touched before, doing what she'd been doing all week. Figuring out systems by instinct and stubbornness because nobody had ever handed her a manual for any of it. The hard drive went into a port on the master server. Somewhere below her, muffled through 2 floors of concrete and carpet, she could hear the low murmur of the keynote beginning, the traitor's voice, amplified, warm and confident and entirely unaware of what was about to happen to it. The upload took 90 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then every screen in the Grand Millennium Ballroom, from the towering display behind the stage to the smaller monitors along the walls, went dark for exactly 2 seconds and came back lit with rows of ledger entries, timestamped wire transfers, and audio waveforms cued to play. Juliet hit the last control with 2 fingers, and the recorded wiretaps began, layered over the traitor's own voice still mid-sentence at the podium. His private conversations, his own words arranging the sale of an empire he didn't own, filling a room full of investors, officials, and cameras that had, until 30 seconds ago, been recording nothing more dramatic than a keynote address. The scream of chairs pushing back reached her even through the control room walls. By the time she made it down to the ballroom level, through a stairwell now crawling with confused security guards who no longer had any idea whose orders to follow, the doors had already burst open under a different authority entirely. Officers who'd never taken a bribe in their careers, the handful Yang Yun had spent the last 3 days quietly, carefully identifying through contacts who owed him more loyalty than fear, moved through the room with warrants that had been sitting ready for exactly this moment. The traitor didn't run. There was nowhere left to run to, not in a room full of cameras that had just broadcast his own voice condemning him. The officials named in the ledger went the same way, pulled from tables where champagne still sat half-poured, their faces caught by the same phones that had, minutes earlier, been filming a keynote speech. Yang Yin found her near the edge of the ballroom, coveralls torn at one shoulder, a shallow cut above his eyebrow that he hadn't noticed yet, and something in his face when he saw her that she'd never seen on him before. Not the careful control of a man managing every room he walked into, but something closer to relief. "It's done," he said, and it wasn't a question. "It's done," she agreed, and let herself, finally, feel the weight of the last week settle out of her shoulders. The weeks that followed moved faster than either of them expected. With the traitor and his allies in custody and the ledger already in the hands of investigators who couldn't unknow what they'd seen, Yang Yun's organization went through the kind of quiet, thorough purge that only happens when the person doing it has absolutely nothing left to prove. The people who'd stayed loyal kept their positions. The people who'd hedged their bets in his absence did not. Within a month, what had nearly collapsed into someone else's hostile takeover had reassembled itself, leaner and considerably harder to betray twice. He came to Auntie Sue's to find her on an ordinary Tuesday, no bodyguards, no announcement, just a folder under one arm and the particular look of a man who'd been planning something for weeks and was finally ready to say it out loud. "I made a promise," he said, sliding into the booth across from her, back in that maintenance room, "before I knew if either of us would survive the week." "You didn't promise me anything in that room. You were too busy not screaming while I stitched your arm." "I promised myself," he said, and pushed the folder across the table. Inside was a deed. A multi-story warehouse near the river, empty for 2 years, structurally sound, with loading bays wide enough for a fleet and office space enough for a company that didn't exist yet. Registered, already, in her name. Not his. Hers, fully and legally, with paperwork that had clearly taken a very expensive lawyer several weeks to make airtight. "It's a logistics hub," he said, before she could ask. 4 couriers. Real contracts, real insurance, real protection. The kind none of you have ever had, working for companies that treat you as replaceable. Health coverage. Legal support if a client or a syndicate or anyone else decides you're an easy target. A union if the drivers want one. You'd run it. Not as my employee. As my partner, with equal stake, because you're the only reason I'm sitting in this booth instead of in the ground. Juliet sat with the folder open in front of her for a long moment, the weight of 2 years of 6-flight staircases and cracked phone screens and delivery apps that had never once asked if she was safe pressing against something in her chest that felt dangerously close to breaking open. "The drivers vote on major decisions," she said finally. "Not just me. Whatever structure you want. It's yours to build. And nobody's tracking anyone's location without their knowledge ever again. Especially not that." She closed the folder, slid it toward herself, and allowed, for the first time since the night she'd swung a helmet at a stranger's wrist in the rain, a full and unguarded smile. 6 months later, the warehouse hummed at every hour of the night, lit and staffed and full of people who'd spent years being invisible and were, for the first time, being paid like they mattered. Juliet stood in the loading bay long past midnight, watching a new driver load her first shift's worth of deliveries under a company logo that hadn't existed a year ago, and thought, not for the first time, that the alley she'd almost driven straight past had turned out to be the best wrong turn of her life. If you've made it this far, you already know the ending mattered more than the getaway car. Drop where you're reading this from, because this one's for every driver the city forgot to look twice at.